Every morning, Nolan Mercer set a bag of groceries on the porch of Walter Pembroke, the lonely old man who lived alone at the end of the street. Nolan had just been fired by Vivian Hartwell, the chief executive of the company he had given 12 years of his life to, yet he never missed a single day of fixing Walter's leaking roof, sorting his pills, or making sure he ate a warm dinner. Then on a rain-soaked night, the door of that quiet house opened. Vivian stood inside her, eyes red, her voice shaking. "Nolan, please come in," she said. On the table behind her sat a file that could destroy everything she had built. If you believe kindness always finds its way back, stay until the very end of this story. The trouble began on an ordinary Monday morning at the headquarters of Hartwell Meridian, when Nolan was summoned to the 42nd floor for what the calendar invitation called an operational structure review. He understood something was wrong the moment his badge failed at the door, refusing him entry into a room he had walked into 1,000 times before. Inside waited only 3 people: Vivian Hartwell, Grant Sloan, and a stone-faced representative from Human Resources holding a folder like a verdict already written. Vivian slid that folder across the table, and Nolan read through accusations that vastly exceeded a maintenance budget by nearly $2 million, deliberately delayed the Black Ridge plant schedule, created division between leadership and the workforce, and refused to comply with a cost optimization plan handed down from above. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee no one had touched, and the city stretched out silently through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Vivian. A view Nolan had once found inspiring, and now simply found cold and distant. Nolan did not raise his voice or plead his case with desperation. He explained calmly and precisely that the so-called overspending was the cost of replacing corroded pressure valves, aging pipelines, and failing sensors that, left untouched, could lead to a catastrophic accident inside the plant. Grant immediately interrupted, insisting Nolan was exaggerating a risk that did not exist simply to protect his own authority within the company. Vivian asked whether Nolan had direct evidence to support his claims, and he answered that every original reading lived inside the internal inspection system untouched and unaltered. Grant declared with practiced confidence that the system contained no critical warnings whatsoever, and for months, Vivian had been under relentless pressure from the board, watching the stock price slide while the bank threatened to reconsider the company's credit line, and Grant had been the one voice constantly assuring her that Nolan was the source of every rising cost. She signed the termination without asking a single further question. Before he was escorted from the room, Nolan looked at her and said quietly that she could erase his name from the payroll, but she could not stop those pipes from cracking. Something flickered across Vivian's face. In that instant, a hesitation she would not admit to herself, but she still nodded for security to walk him out. After 12 years of loyalty, Nolan left the building carrying nothing but a small cardboard box, passing co-workers he had once helped through their hardest days, none of whom dared to say a word as he walked by. Nolan had joined Hartwell Meridian at 29, a young engineer with calloused hands and an instinct for machinery most people spent decades trying to develop, and he had risen through the ranks, not through political maneuvering but through a reputation for solving problems no one else wanted to touch. He had buried a wife 11 years earlier and raised a daughter alone through every ordinary crisis of childhood, and somewhere in those long years of quiet discipline, he had learned that panic solved nothing, that the only real answer to any crisis was patience paired with clear thinking. That same steadiness followed him out of the building that afternoon, even as everything he had built for over a decade collapsed behind him in a single signature. That evening, Nolan returned to his modest house on Briarwood Lane, and as he stood at his own front door, he noticed Walter struggling across the fence with a bag of soil far too heavy for a man his age. Despite everything that had happened only hours earlier, Nolan crossed the yard without hesitation and helped him carry it inside. The box weighed almost nothing, yet Nolan carried it as though it held every year he had given the company, and Walter seemed to sense the weight without needing to be told. He said nothing about being fired, and Walter never asked, choosing instead to glance once at the box in Nolan's hands, before offering a strange observation about how some doors close simply because the person inside is afraid of what a visitor might see. Nolan brushed it off as the vague musing of an old man living too much inside his own thoughts. That night, after Nolan had gone home, Walter quietly opened an old metal safe hidden behind a bookshelf revealing a faded photograph of himself standing beside the original founder of Hartwell Meridian, alongside a stock certificate bearing a seal that had not been used in decades. In the weeks that followed, Nolan tried to rebuild his life from nothing, submitting application after application, only to be rejected again and again, until one hiring manager finally admitted that an internal reference from Hartwell Meridian described him as difficult to work with and financially reckless. Nolan understood exactly what that meant. Grant was systematically closing every door available to him, one company at a time, making certain that no rival firm would ever offer Nolan a second chance. Still, his routine with Walter never wavered, and each morning he arrived to buy groceries and medicine, check the furnace, replace a burnt bulb, or repair a rotting porch step. And afterward, the two men would sit together over coffee, even though Walter rarely offered more than a few short sentences in return. The house was large but strangely cold, filled with technical manuals, old blueprints, and photographs that had been turned to face the wall, and out of respect for the old man's privacy, Nolan never once asked about his past. One quiet afternoon, Walter finally asked why Nolan kept coming back when his own life had fallen apart. Nolan answered that kindness was never meant to be an investment made in hope of a return, and that helping someone only when life was easy was not really kindness at all. Walter then asked whether Nolan hated Vivian for what she had done, and Nolan admitted he was angry about the decision, but felt no hatred toward the woman herself, because he believed she was running a company on information someone else had carefully selected for her to see. That answer lingered in Walter's mind long after Nolan had gone home. The house on Briarwood Lane, Nolan noticed over those weeks, was full of things half-remembered and half-hidden: sketches of turbines and pressure systems folded into old newspapers, a drafting table pushed into a corner and covered with a bedsheet, and a stack of unopened letters addressed to a Hartwell family Nolan had never once heard Walter mention by name. He never pried, and Walter never explained, and the two men settled into an easy rhythm built entirely on presence rather than curiosity. Meanwhile, inside Hartwell, Meridian cracks began appearing everywhere. After Nolan's departure, as 3 shift supervisors resigned within a single week, workers at Blackridge filed a formal complaint. Emergency repair costs doubled overnight, and a major client demanded a full inspection of the production line. While Vivian began replaying Nolan's warning in her head, but Grant assured her the unrest was nothing more than loyal employees mourning a manager they had grown too attached to, and he suggested shutting down the independent inspection department entirely in favor of a consulting firm he personally recommended. She agreed against her better judgment, though a quiet unease settled over her that she could not fully explain. Around that same time, Walter accidentally dropped a small metal pin while reaching for his coffee cup, and when Nolan picked it up to hand it back, he recognized the emblem immediately as the original logo Hartwell Meridian had used decades earlier. Long before it became the glass tower it was today. When Nolan asked about it, Walter offered only a single cryptic reply, saying he had once known a few people who built that place before it turned into a building full of locked doors. A secret phone call soon reached Nolan from Russell Vaughn, a supervisor he had once trained and trusted completely. Russell reported that pressure readings at Blackridge had begun fluctuating dangerously, exactly as Nolan had warned months earlier, and that Grant had ordered production to continue while forbidding anyone from logging the anomaly in the Plessens official system. Russell sent photographs of the gauges, along with copies of the operational logbook, and Nolan immediately saw that the numbers were creeping toward a threshold that could no longer be ignored. He urged Russell to shut the line down, but Russell explained that only Vivian or Grant held the authority to make that call, and that stopping production without permission could get the entire operating team dismissed on the spot. Nolan faced an impossible choice, since he was no longer an employee, and any attempt to intervene could easily be framed as sabotage rather than concern. Yet staying silent meant leaving hundreds of workers exposed to real danger. Walter noticed the weight sitting on Nolan's shoulders, and after several evasive answers, Nolan finally told him everything about Blackridge. Walter did not react with the surprise of an ordinary man hearing this for the first time, and instead asked precise, technical questions about the exact valve type, the year it was installed, and the production line code. His questions were sharp enough that Nolan began to suspect there was far more to this old man than he had ever imagined. Walter explained almost casually that he had once been an engineer who designed industrial pressure systems, and he asked Nolan to sketch the plant layout from memory right there at the kitchen table. Studying the rough sketch, Walter pointed to a backup discharge line that almost no one still remembered existed, warning that if Grant had cut maintenance in that exact section, pressure could be forced back into the main processing zone, rupture the entire system. Nolan realized in that moment that Walter understood the architecture of that plant better than he ever had, and a quiet, unspoken question began forming in the back of his mind about exactly who this soft-spoken old man on Briarwood Lane truly was. He thought back to the pin, shaped like the company's original emblem, to the drafting table, hidden under a bedsheet, to the way Walter had rattled off valve specifications like a man reciting his own address, and none of it fit the story of an ordinary retiree who spent his afternoons alone with a crossword puzzle. Nolan did not ask outright, sensing that whatever truth Walter was guarding had cost him something enormous to bury, but he filed the questions away and returned his full attention to the danger unfolding at Blackridge. Back at headquarters, Vivian received a report claiming every reading at Blackridge remained perfectly normal, yet, when she demanded minute-by-minute data instead of a daily summary, Grant stalled, offering excuses instead of numbers. Quietly, Vivian reached out to Marissa Bell and asked her to review the system access logs, and Marissa discovered that Nolan's old account had been used to approve several maintenance reports after the date of his termination, which meant someone was deliberately framing a man who no longer even worked there. Vivian's suspicion turned toward Grant, though she could not act openly, since he controlled the company's relationship with the bank and held sway over most of the board. Then late one night, Russell called Nolan in a panic, reporting that a main valve had begun vibrating in a way none of them had ever heard before. Yet Grant still ordered the line kept running for another 48 hours to complete a contract worth $24 million. Nolan rose immediately, ready to drive straight to the plant, but Walter blocked the doorway and told him that walking in alone now would only get him labeled a trespasser, and that this time he needed something stronger than courage. He needed lawful power behind him. Nolan wanted to argue every instinct in him pulling toward the door, and the 24-hour drive it would take to reach the plant before dawn, but something in Walter's tone made him pause. A certainty that did not belong to a frightened old neighbor offering vague comfort. Walter told him to trust that help was already closer than he realized, and though Nolan had no way of understanding what that meant, he chose for the first time in weeks to wait rather than act alone. A heavy rainstorm swept through Ashbourne that night, and Nolan had come by to check the section of Walter's roof he knew had been leaking, only to find a sleek black sedan parked in the driveway. The door opened before he could even knock. Vivian Hartwell stood on the other side, no longer wearing the cold composure of the executive from the 42nd floor, her coat soaked through and her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. She looked at Nolan for a long moment before speaking, telling him quietly that they no longer had much time. Inside, Walter sat at the kitchen table surrounded by the founding documents of Hartwell Meridian, the original inspection reports from Blackridge, a stock certificate carrying special voting rights, a handwritten letter from the company's founder, and clear evidence that Grant had been funneling her maintenance funds into a network of shell companies. Vivian finally revealed that Walter was her own grandfather and one of the two men who had originally built the company from nothing. Years earlier, Walter had fought bitterly against her father's decision to transform an engineering firm into a purely financial empire, and after a painful argument he walked away from the board, entirely moved to Briarwood Lane and cutting off contact with the family for good. Vivian had not seen him in nearly a decade. Walter still held 18% of the company, along with a founder's veto. He had never once exercised, believing the company needed to prove on its own that it still deserved to survive. Vivian admitted she had only come to him after Marissa uncovered proof that Grant was falsifying data, and that she desperately needed his voting power to suspend Grant before the board convened the following morning. Walter refused to hand over that authority right away. He told Vivian she had fired an honest man without ever checking the evidence herself, and that she could not simply appear at his door, now asking for a signature to save her own position. He demanded that she apologize to Nolan directly, not as a chief executive protecting her company, but as the person who had genuinely wronged an innocent man. Vivian turned to Nolan and admitted she had chosen convenience over the truth. and she was not asking him to forget what had happened, only to help her save the people still working at Blackridge. Nolan did not offer forgiveness right away, instead asking Vivian whether once this crisis passed, she would continue letting profit decide the value of a human life. She answered not with a promise, but with an action, placing her own executive badge on the table and telling him that if she could not fix this, she would step down from the company herself. By the end of that night, Walter signed a temporary authorization for Vivian, but he added one binding condition, stating that every decision concerning Blackridge over the next 72 hours required the signature of Nolan Mercer, acting as an independent safety advisor. Nolan, Vivian, and Marissa drove to headquarters together in the middle of the night. Security initially refused Nolan entry because his name still sat on a restricted list, so Vivian swiped her own badge, opened the door herself, and declared that Nolan was returning under emergency executive authority, a moment that stood in sharp contrast to the day he had been escorted out under the same roof. Grant was already on a video call with Everett Dane and several board members, and the instant he saw Nolan appear, he accused Vivian of being manipulated by a bitter former employee. Vivian demanded that Grant surrender full access to Blackridge's systems, and he stalled, claiming the servers were undergoing routine maintenance. But Nolan recognized immediately that Grant was simply buying time to erase the evidence. Marissa moved quickly, activating a legal hold on the electronic records and locking down the financial servers before anything could be deleted. Grant erupted, insisting Vivian was actively sabotaging the very company she was supposed to protect. Nolan stayed focused on the plant itself, reaching Russell by phone and guiding the operating team through a careful section-by-section pressure reduction designed to avoid a sudden shutdown that could trigger a dangerous backflow. Walter joined the call as well, referencing original blueprints that existed nowhere else but in his own private files. It was Nolan who discovered that a critical backup valve had been quietly removed 6 months earlier, sold off by Grant, and logged simply as obsolete equipment, leaving the system with no way to release pressure if temperatures continued climbing. Vivian gave the order to halt the entire production line. Grant warned that the decision would cost the company its $24 million contract and violate its obligations to the bank, and he immediately pushed the board to vote on suspending Vivian before the sun even rose. Everett scheduled an emergency session for 6 o'clock that morning, leaving Nolan only a few hours to stabilize the plant and prove beyond any doubt that the danger was real and not exaggerated. He guided the technical team in reopening an old secondary pipeline that had been sealed for years, a task made far more dangerous by the fact that no current schematic marked its exact location anymore. Walter remembered every detail from memory, though his voice grew weaker and more strained as the night wore on, worrying Nolan more with every passing minute. Vivian offered to take him straight to the hospital, but Walter refused to leave until the plant itself was safe. Just then, Russell reported that pressure was rising faster than anyone had predicted, and Nolan finally understood the full extent of what Grant had done. He had not only cut maintenance funding, he had secretly pushed the plant's output past its designed capacity in order to disguise a shortfall in revenue. Every quarter that fell short of projections, Grant had simply turned the dial a little higher, trusting that the machinery would absorb the strain long enough for him to move on before anyone noticed the pattern, and for a long time it worked exactly as he intended. Nolan and Vivian traveled straight to Blackridge since she wanted to witness the truth firsthand, rather than continue receiving filtered reports from her office. The drive took nearly 2 hours, and for most of it neither spoke, the silence broken only by the wipers sweeping rain from the windshield and the occasional crackle of Russell's voice over the radio, updating them on numbers that climbed steadily, no matter how the team tried to slow them. Several managers Grant had personally installed tried to block Nolan from entering the control room, but Vivian announced on the spot that any order obstructing safety procedures would be suspended immediately. Nolan quickly divided the operating team into 3 groups, one working to cool the compression chamber, another inspecting the backup line, and a third isolating the section most at risk of rupture. He could not simply shut the entire system down at once, because dropping pressure too quickly would damage the line and force industrial fluid into the processing zone, so every step had to be measured with precision. For the first time, Vivian watched Nolan operate inside a full-blown crisis, and she saw a man who never shouted, never assigned blame, and never tried to prove he was right. A man who remembered the name of every worker around him understood the sound of the machinery well enough to know exactly what each vibration meant. Russell found a section of pipe that had already begun to warp, giving them barely an hour before pressure would exceed every safe limit. Nolan asked Vivian to authorize breaking the seal on the old discharge route, a move that would destroy nearly $9 million of equipment, but save the entire facility and every person inside it. Vivian signed without a moment's hesitation, and that single decision marked the first true sign that she had changed, willing now to sacrifice money in order to protect people rather than the other way around. While the technical teams executed the plan, Marissa called with news that she had found an email in which Grant instructed an outside firm to falsify its inspection findings, along with a trail of payments connecting him directly to Everett. Dane. Everett had not merely been protecting Grant out of loyalty. He had been paid to approve every dangerous round of safety cuts. Grant himself had already vanished from headquarters and was racing toward Blackridge, intent on reaching the backup server room to erase what little evidence remained. When he arrived, he tried to convince Vivian that Nolan was destroying the company out of revenge, insisting that Walter was too old and frail for his authorization to hold up legally. The work itself was brutal and unglamorous hours, spent crouched beside groaning machinery under floodlights, while rain hammered the metal roof above them, and more than once a gauge spiked without warning, sending workers scrambling while Nolan called out corrections in a voice that never once cracked under the strain. Vivian stayed beside him through all of it, no longer issuing commands from behind a desk, but hauling equipment alongside men and women she had only ever known through quarterly reports. And for the first time in years, she understood viscerally what her decisions on the 42nd floor actually cost the people who carried them out. Standing in front of the entire operating crew, Vivian openly admitted that she had been wrong to fire Nolan in the first place. She declared loud enough for everyone to hear that the man she had once forced out of the company was now the only person actively trying to save it, and that from that moment forward every order Nolan gave would carry more weight than her own. Nolan activated the final discharge route, and pressure began to fall, but one control mechanism jammed at the worst possible moment. Russell moved to enter the danger zone and force it open by hand, but Nolan stopped him and instead found another solution buried in Walter's old designs, using a legacy pneumatic system to trigger the valve remotely. The plant stabilized with only minutes to spare, and no one was hurt. Just as everyone believed the crisis had finally passed, Marissa delivered devastating news. The board had already voted to suspend Vivian from her role as chief executive, and Grant and Everett were preparing to seize control of the company by 8 o'clock that same morning. Vivian, Nolan, and Marissa returned to headquarters to face the board, directly arriving to find Grant had already rewritten the entire narrative in his favor. He claimed there had never been any serious danger at Blackridge, that Nolan had manufactured panic for his own purposes, that Vivian's decision to halt production had been driven purely by emotion, that the $9 million in play losses proved nothing but poor leadership, and that Walter had simply been manipulated into signing away control of the company. Everett ordered security to remove Nolan from the room, but this time, Vivian stepped directly in front of him and declared he would never be pushed out again. Marissa laid out the falsified emails and the financial transfers in careful detail, and Grant countered by arguing the evidence had been obtained improperly and could never hold up to scrutiny. Several board members hesitated, still fearing the bank would pull its funding if Grant were formally accused of a crime. It was at that exact moment that the doors of the boardroom swung open, and Walter stepped inside, leaning on his wooden cane, carrying an old leather case, returning to the 42nd floor for the first time in more than 20 years, and several of the oldest board members recognized him. Instantly, Walter laid out the original blueprints of Blackridge, the founder's clause granting his special voting rights records, proving Grant had violated core safety principles, evidence connecting Everett to a fraudulent consulting fund, logs showing Nolan had repeatedly warned of exactly this danger long before it happened. He did not spend his time defending Vivian. Instead, he stated plainly that she bore real responsibility for placing blind trust in the wrong people and firing an innocent man without ever checking the facts herself. Still, he insisted that mistakes could be repaired if the person responsible was willing to face the truth head-on. Walter asked the board to vote on 3 matters ending Grant's authority over the company, removing Everett from his position as chairman, and formally restoring Nolan's title and reputation. Grant lost his composure, completely accusing Walter of returning only to seek revenge against the family that had cast him aside. Walter answered that he had not come back for the family name or for his shares, but because a stranger had brought food to his door every single morning, without ever knowing who he really was. He told the board plainly that if they wanted to know who truly deserved to lead this company, they should look at how a person treats someone who can offer them nothing in return. A hush fell over the room as he spoke, the kind of silence that only comes when powerful people realize the ground beneath them has shifted. And even Grant, who had spent the entire meeting on his feet, gesturing at charts and figures, sank slowly back into his chair without another word. Several board members who had known Walter decades earlier rose instinctively when he finished an old, almost forgotten gesture of respect. None of the younger executives in the room understood, but every one of them felt compelled to follow. His special voting power tipped the outcome decisively. Grant and Everett were suspended on the spot. Financial investigators were notified immediately, and Vivian was permitted to remain as chief executive, though now under the oversight of a newly formed reform committee. The board offered to reinstate Nolan as director of operations, but he refused to sign anything right away, telling them that dignity could not be restored simply by handing back a chair that had been taken from him, and that the company owed real change to every employee it had ever mistreated, not only to him. Some board members shifted uncomfortably at that, unused to hearing a returning employee set terms rather than express gratitude. But Marissa noted quietly that this was precisely the kind of leadership the company had been missing for years, someone unwilling to accept a quiet settlement in place of an honest reckoning. Days later, Vivian traveled to Walter's house to see Nolan arriving without a lawyer, a contract, or any financial offer. She carried only the cardboard box of personal belongings he had once been forced to carry out of the building. Having gathered each item back herself, including his worn coffee mug, a plaque marking 10 years of service, his old operations notebook, a photograph of the Blackridge technical team, and the seed employee badge that had once been deactivated in front of him. She admitted that she used to believe an apology was a form of weakness, but now understood that an apology only meant anything when the person offering it accepted the consequences and did not expect forgiveness right away. Vivian offered to bring Nolan back with 3 new conditions attached to his role, granting him full authority to halt any production line whenever safety was at risk, a direct reporting line to the board itself, and the power to rebuild an independent inspection department that no financial officer could ever alter again, alongside a new fund created specifically to protect employees who came forward to report wrongdoing. Nolan still did not agree right away, asking her plainly whether she wanted him back because the company needed his skills or because she genuinely believed he deserved respect. Vivian answered that both were true, but that the second reason mattered more, and she promised to publicly admit her failure in front of every employee and every reporter who asked, even if it cost her the position entirely. Nolan realized, listening to her, that Vivian was no longer trying to manage the consequences of what had happened. She was finally beginning to take responsibility for them. Walter encouraged Nolan not to let his own pain harden into a permanent wall, reminding him that forgiveness did not mean pretending nothing had happened, but choosing not to let someone else's mistake control the rest of his life. Nolan agreed to return for 6 months as Director of Operational Reform, not as an employee under Vivian's authority, but as an equal partner in rebuilding the company, insisting every change be written into formal company policy rather than left to promises. Vivian accepted every condition without argument, and in the days that followed, she drafted the new policies herself, rather than delegating the task to legal counsel, sitting late into the night at her kitchen table with a stack of yellow legal pads, determined that this time the words on paper would mean exactly what they said. She called Marissa constantly to check her language against every loophole Grant might once have exploited, and she insisted the final documents be read aloud to the full board, rather than simply circulated for a quiet signature. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that never made headlines, but it was the first real evidence that her transformation was not a performance staged for one difficult evening on Briarwood Lane. Before she left that evening, she asked Walter why he had never once told Nolan who he truly was. Walter answered simply that he had needed to know whether the man helping him was helping a lonely old neighbor or a man worth millions in company shares, and that Nolan had given him the answer from the very first day. Later that night, Walter suffered a violent coughing fit, quietly slipping the results of a recent medical test into his coat pocket before anyone could see them. And Nolan began to suspect with a growing sense of dread that the old man beside him might not have as much time left as they all hoped. The 6 months that followed proved that repairing a company took far more effort than replacing a single broken valve. Nolan restored the independent inspection team from the ground up, brought back the supervisors who had been quietly forced out months earlier, made the entire safety budget fully transparent, established a direct reporting channel for every worker on the floor, eliminated bonus structures built entirely around short-term profit, and required senior leadership to spend real time working inside the plants themselves every quarter. Vivian kept her word as well, calling a company-wide meeting where she stood in front of thousands of employees and openly apologized to Nolan by name, refusing to place the entire blame on Grant alone, admitting that her own arrogance, her habit of only listening to convenient information had turned her into a tool for a man she should never have trusted. Grant and Everett were formally charged with financial fraud, falsified. Hartwell Meridian suffered serious financial losses in the process, but avoided total collapse by choosing full transparency, which gradually rebuilt trust among both its employees and its clients. The relationship between Nolan and Vivian shifted from open conflict into genuine professional respect, growing slowly and never rushing toward anything romantic, grounded instead in mutual trust and the personal growth each of them had gone through. Vivian began visiting Walter regularly, and their early conversations were stiff and awkward, but they gradually deepened into something honest. She apologized for years spent believing he had simply abandoned the family, and Walter admitted his own fault in using silence as a weapon against the people he loved most. One evening, Walter led both Nolan and Vivian out to the garage behind his house and showed them the very first model of the energy system that had led to the founding of Hartwell Meridian, telling them he wanted the company to return to its original purpose, where engineering existed to serve people rather than treat them as costs to be cut whenever convenient. Walter's health continued to decline, and he refused any long hospital stay, wanting only to remain in the small house at the end of the street. Nolan still brought groceries every single morning, even though Walter could easily have afforded a full team of caretakers by then. Vivian began visiting every Sunday, as well, no longer arriving as a chief executive chasing a signature, but simply as a granddaughter trying to make up for years that could never be returned. Not long before the end, Walter handed Nolan a sealed envelope and asked him not to open it until after the company's annual shareholder meeting, telling him that the day he lost his job was the day the company lost its direction, and the day he helped a nameless old man was the day it finally began to find its soul. Again, 1 year later, Hartwell Meridian held its annual shareholder meeting, and the Black Ridge plant reported the safest operating record in its entire history. Employee turnover had dropped sharply, major clients had returned, and the company was recovering without sacrificing a single technical standard along the way. The board formally confirmed Vivian as chief executive, though she insisted her performance be measured not only by profit but by workplace safety and employee trust as well. Nolan was offered the position of global director of operations, and he accepted on one condition: that he still be given the time to care for Walter whenever he needed him. Walter could not attend the meeting himself due to his failing health, choosing instead to watch it unfold on a small screen from his living room on Briarwood Lane. Afterward, Nolan and Vivian returned to visit him, and Walter had already set out 3 cups of coffee, but he drifted quietly to sleep in the chair by the window before either of them arrived. He passed away peacefully in his own home beside a family photograph that had finally been set back upright on the shelf where it belonged. There was no grand funeral. In keeping with his final wishes, a simple memorial was held at the very first engineering workshop of Hartwell Meridian, where workers, engineers, and everyone who had ever worked alongside him gathered to say goodbye. Nolan stood near the old workbench, where the very first pressure model had once taken shape, and Vivian stood beside him, neither of them speaking much, both understanding that some grief needed nothing more than presence to be honored properly. Russell was there too, along with dozens of workers from Black Ridge, who had never once met the man responsible for the safety standards, now protecting their lives, each of them lighting a small candle along the workshop floor until the room glowed with a quiet, steady warmth that felt for a moment like the very thing Walter had spent his whole life trying to build. Nolan finally opened the envelope Walter had left behind. Inside was not a claim to the company's remaining wealth or ownership, but proof that Walter had transferred the majority of his shares into an independent trust created to support employees facing hardship fund technical scholarships for adults seeking a second career, protect whistleblowers who came forward with the truth, and finance ongoing industrial safety programs across the company. Tucked at the very back of the envelope was a short handwritten note. Walter had clearly rewritten more than once, the ink pressed hard into the paper, as though he wanted the words to last. He wrote that he had spent the final years of his life believing wealth had cost him his family, only to discover through a stranger's simple kindness that it had merely been waiting for the right hands to hold it, and that he trusted no hands more than the ones that had carried his groceries up the porch steps every single morning, without ever asking for anything in return. Nolan was named to manage that trust, not because he needed the money, but because Walter trusted he would never forget who it was truly meant for. Walter also left the house at the end of the street to Nolan, who chose never to sell it. He repaired the roof, opened the windows that had stayed shut for years, and turned Walter's old study into a free counseling center for workers who had been unfairly dismissed or mistreated by their employers. On a quiet autumn morning, Vivian arrived at that same house, carrying 2 bags of groceries, the same kind Nolan had once left on Walter's porch every single day. Nolan opened the door and asked, smiling, why a chief executive was delivering groceries herself. Vivian answered that someone had once taught her that the way a person treats another who can offer them nothing in return reveals exactly who they truly are. Nolan stepped aside and invited her in. The same door that had once opened to reveal a betrayal now opened onto something new, a beginning built on honesty instead of convenience. On the wall inside hung the original Hartwell Meridian emblem, and beneath it remained the words Walter had once spoken, and never let anyone forget that a company could be built from steel and money, but only kindness could ever make it. Worth saving.